Welcome back to another video, guys. Today we're going to jump into the Quadzilla 500 engine. I couldn't go ahead building this engine without doing a video showing you guys how it's done, especially because the Quadzilla is just such an iconic quad. If you're new to this series, we spent a pretty extensive amount of time preparing these cases. They were damaged pretty badly. This motor was completely blown. The top end was completely shot. The bottom end was pretty messed up too. Luckily, we were able to repair everything. We should be good to go. We are going to be referring to the factory Suzuki service manual. I was not able to find a Climbers or a Haynes manual for this thing, so I had to shell out 70 bucks for this manual. It's pricey, but it's definitely worth it. If you guys are doing work on any of your machines, I always recommend a service manual. So I've got my transmission, my service manual, my crankcases, and I also have the crank in the refrigerator right now, so the metal will shrink slightly, and that should help us install it. I've gone ahead and put new crank bearings in here. I put new seals in the entire engine, so all of that stuff is already done. We might as well hop right into it. Before I do it, please give me a thumbs up if you enjoy these videos or if they help you out. I appreciate that a lot, and also consider subscribing if you've been enjoying the content. All right, let's jump into it. All right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and put the crank in. So we have our left side case half. It's the side with the stator on it. This is the side that we're gonna place our crank into first. Before I get started, this is a 1987 Suzuki Quadzilla LT500R. If you guys are using the Suzuki service manual, in the top right corner, I will have whatever section of the service manual to refer to if you're following along with this video. All right, let me lay this down. And we've got our crank right here. You can see it is freezing cold. And hopefully, because of that, we'll be able to drop this thing in place. Yep, I think we got it, actually. That when you freeze the metal like that, it shrinks it. It's close. It's not quite all the way in there. We can pull it in with the crank tool. You don't want to beat on this thing with a hammer because you can throw your crank out of whack. Now, before installing this, I did put the crank in the truing stand, and it did check out in spec. All right, now we're going to use our Tusk flywheel puller. Great tool to have. Kind of necessary. A lot of times when you do these engine builds, it's really a must-have to put these things, to have these tools if you want to do the job right. We've got our adapter, threads on the end here, and this will butt up against that. Thread this on. And now we are attached to the end of our crank. Slide our tube on. We've got a nut that goes on the end here. We've got two crossbars. We want to make sure they are on portions of the case that at least are somewhat fortified if possible, because you're going to be putting pressure against them. And you want to make sure your rod, let me pull this up just a little bit, your rod is facing upwards. Sometimes if it's not facing upwards, you can get it stuck in the cases. So you want to make sure that's lined up properly. All right, now we're going to go ahead and crank this down. And as I'm doing that, you guys see it's closing up the gap. And there it is. That one was easy. Sometimes they're a little bit tighter. Having the crank cold definitely helps, but you can see the rod hits. So if you were down here, you'd be putting pressure on the rod, or it gets stuck in the cases. Sometimes you don't want to do that. You want to make sure it's facing the proper way. Next thing we're going to put in is the transmission. I'm going to go ahead and lube up with the bearings with some assembly lube. Going to be using some Maxima assembly lube. I will have this linked in the description section below. It's definitely a good idea. Make sure you got plenty of lube in here for your first startup. Don't want to go in dry. So here's our transmission. You're going to mesh it together and put it in place. I've already gone through this transmission, made sure that all the clips and washers and gears are in the proper place. I inspected the gears and whatnot, made sure they were good. I'm going to do this in hopefully a way that you guys can see. Just kind of take your time, and they usually just pop in place once everything lines up. There we go. Roll it around, make sure everything's nice and free. Now we're going to put our shift forks in and our shift detent. So here's the shift detent here. You got a spring that hooks in the bottom, and this will go in the bottom. Most of the time, these are on the outside. For right now, we're just going to kind of leave that in place like so. And then our third fork goes in first. You can see it says 43B-3A. The 3 means it's the third fork. You want to make sure this little post is facing towards where the cam goes. And of course, we got it lubed up and want to be going in dry. There's a slot where that fits. Then we'll put our shift shaft in, and this shift shaft goes through the detent as well. And then we'll take that spring. We're going to make sure it's hooked in the end of the detent, and then it goes on a little post in here. Sorry if you guys can't see. The post is right there. You see that puts spring tension on the detent. That's our cam stopper. There's a shift star on this side. Like I said, this is usually not in the center cases, at least not from what I've seen. So we'll go ahead and put this in actually in a second. Before you do that, we're going to put in our number 2. See, it says 2A. Number 2 fork. Again, making sure the pin is facing towards where the shift cam will go. Slide that in the correct slot. And then here is number 1. I don't know if you guys can see, it says 1A. They're kind of worn down. This is an old quad, man. 1987. This thing is older than dirt. Older than me. Take our shift shaft, put that in place. Now, since we've got the shift detent going on in here, going to try a different method of getting this cam in place. I'm going to take the spring off and pull these shafts up so that we can pull the shift forks out to the side. Now here's our shift cam. Here is the shift star. You can see it's keyed. Then we have a washer that goes on top. I've already put plenty of assembly lube on here. Let's see if we can sneak this in place. All right, there's that. Now if we can get this detent arm. There may be an easier way to do this, but this is just the way I'm doing it. Now we can bring these shift forks into place. Get that shaft in place. Boom. And now we just have to put our spring on. So we'll hook the one side, and I'm going to use the screwdriver method to get the other side on. Just put your screwdriver through the spring, put the other end on the pin where it's hooking up, and then you just pull back. We're going to use another screwdriver here to slide it in place. There we go. All right, guys, we're ready to put our second case half on. You can see we are cleaned up, surfaced, ready to go. Did put a new crank bearing in here. These Quadzillas are known for these bearing, the inner bore where the outer race sits. They wear out and then the outer race will spin. These were in really good shape. So I'm gonna go ahead and put some sealant on these cases. Of course, they say Suzuki Bond in the service manual. We're gonna use some Yama Bond, it's the same stuff. 3 Bond 1215, it's the same formula. We go ahead and put it on both halves of the cases, nice and thin. You'll see I'm gonna use like a dabbing motion. That kind of helps give a nice even layer, and then we'll place the cases together. All right, now we've got 2 dowel pins. Put a little bit of anti-seize on them. Put them in place. There is 1 on each side. I'll take our other case half, line it up, and hopefully this thing just drops right in place. Take your time, make sure everything is lined up. Oh yeah. Nice. Didn't even have to pull it into place. Wow. That was easy. Now I'm going to take this and flip it around so we can get to our case bolts. All right, I'm just going to drop our case bolts in place. The way that I do this is literally just put them in so that they're all sticking out the same amount. It's really as easy as that. And we've got this little plate that's going to go right here. I'm going to pull all these in place with the Milwaukee. This is a great impact gun. It's got little settings right here. If you're really not careful with these, then put it on number 1. You're not going to strip anything out. I got it on number 2 because it's a little bit quicker. And we're just going to go in a crisscross pattern and bring these into place. Now I'm going to go around with a hand wrench. Just snug these down. If you're going to torque them, go to about 8 foot-pounds. Got a pretty good feel for this. So I'll just do it by hand. Now I'll go around, wipe up any excess case sealer that spilled out. All right, now we're going to come to the stator side of the engine, and we're going to put our shift cam bolt in. So this is the back side of the shift cam. We've got a 10mm bolt and a washer. Put some blue Loctite on here. Put that in place. I'm just going to snug that up. You have to roll it until it stops. Then we've got the cap that goes on. Got a new O-ring on there. Definitely want to replace that. And this will thread in place. And then for things like this, I literally use a flat washer held by vice grips. The washer's just the right size for this. Makes it pretty easy. And just snug that down. Now we're going to move over to our sprocket. Before we put this collar on, take a little bit of grease and just get it in our seal. Just a little bit, that'll spread around. And we'll take our collar, push it in place. Then we have our sprocket, face it with the ridge inward. Then we've got a locking washer, then our nut. Now I'm just going to spin this in place for now. I don't like to tighten these up until the engine's on the bike and the chain's in place, just to hold everything. Now we're going to put our counterbalancer in place. It slides right through here. There is, you'll see on the front of this, the top is rounded or has a little bit of a cutaway. You need to line that up with the case portion. If you look inside, you'll be able to see it. This should just slide right into place. You just got to guide it through and it comes out the other side of your case. There we go. All right, now we'll put our stator in place. We've got a little rubber grommet. Fits into the case. And I've got a little bit of blue Loctite on these bolts. Now you can see up here, there's a little hash mark on the stator plate. And then there's a little hash on the case. And you want to line that up right in the center. Now the engine rotates in a counterclockwise fashion. So if you wanted to, or this way actually, so if you wanted to advance the timing, you would rotate the plate to the right. If you wanted to retard the timing, you go to the left. So I'm going to put it right in the center at stock, since we're not doing a performance build here. I'll just snug these down. Now we'll put our flywheel in. Got our flywheel key. Put that in place. There is our flywheel. Cleaned this up, man. This had all kinds of corrosion and like oxidation on it. It looks like shit. Make sure you're lined up with your key. And you've got a washer. I'm going to put red Loctite on here. And spin on our flywheel nut. Then I'm going to use this Tusk flywheel holding tool. You can get these on with the impact. Just boss them on there. That's usually the way I do it. But ever since I got this tool, I like to torque these down. This tool really makes it easy. And we're going to go to 72 foot-pounds. Right, now we can get our stator cover on there. So I got a brand new gasket right here. Going to put grease on it. This just helps so that if you have to take it off, the gasket will not be stuck to the case half, because nobody likes taking off old, crappy, dingy gasket material. So this also gives a little bit of a sealing effect, and it helps hold the gasket in place. Here's our cover. Got this nice and surfaced. Shouldn't be any leaks on this bike. Not that a leak would come from the stator cover, but it's always good to be airtight. We don't want any water getting in there. And I'm just going to run these in by hand. Again, if you're going to torque these, go to about 8 foot-pounds. All right, now we're going to go ahead and put our gear shift cam in and our shift fork. So here is our gear shift cam. Got these 5 teeth on it, and our shift pawls are going to go in this side. So the shift pawls they're kind of weird looking. They have like an offset to them. So you want to make sure that you put these in correctly. So the first thing we're going to do is take this spring, put the spring in place. And then there's this little piston. We have a rounded top and a flat. Put the flat portion inward. Sorry if you guys can't see this, it's kind of tiny. You got to hold that there and take your shift pawl and make sure that you have the thicker portion up here facing the toothed portion of your gear shaft cam. So we'll put that in place. You can see how it fits. Then we're going to do the same thing with the other side. So there's that. We're going to place this into our shift cam like so. Put a little assembly lube in here. Now we've got these 2 plates that are going to basically retain this mechanism. One goes on this side, the other one goes on the other side, and we're going to use a little bit of blue Loctite on our screws. And this back plate will go in facing in this direction with the little thin tab facing the gear shift cam. All right, now the shift shaft will go in place. I'm gonna put some lubricant on this before we push it in. That's what she said. Oh, I just realized that plate, you don't want it sitting on top of your shift pawl right here. Just gonna make sure that it all moves nice and free. Now we can line this up. We want it to go right in the center, like that. Boom, good to go. You can see the middle, the third tooth right here goes right in the center of the shift fork. So that's all lined up. All right, now we're gonna put our Kickstarter assembly together. So on the back of our kickstart shaft, I don't know if you guys can see, there is a little punch mark right there between those 2 splines. And then on our catch, there's a punch mark as well. It's a really small punch mark. You want to make sure that those are aligned. You slide this in place. And then on the back, we have a spring and a washer. There's also this stopper plate up here. If I didn't remove this, but if you did remove it, there's a plate behind it and then a plate on top. It's a 2-piece assembly. We're going to slide this in place. Make sure you got the washer back there. And then we're going to take we have a spring on the outside that needs to be spun, and there's a plastic spacer on the inside. You want to make sure that that's in there as well. And then we'll take our return spring, a pair of pliers, and stretch this around into the spring catch, like so. There's that. And then up in the front, we have our power valve actuator. Put this in place. These screws get blue Loctite. And put some lube in on that bearing. Then we're gonna put our actuator arm in place in this orientation. Come through the top here. We'll spin this little clip around. It'll snap into place. There we go. Almost. There we go. Now we're going to put our primary drive gear spacer right on the end of our crank. There is an O-ring in there. You want to make sure you put a new O-ring in there if you have one. And we're going to go with the O-ring facing inward. And I did put some lube in our crank seal. And make sure that's good to go. Might have to wiggle this on just a little bit because you got the O-ring in there. We'll just pop that in place. And make sure your seal isn't rolled too. This looks good. All right, now we'll put the other half of our counterbalancer on. We have a key that goes in here. Get that in place. This can't be put on in the incorrect orientation as long as you have the depression in the front. There's that. And we have the balancer drive gear. That's got a slot for the key as well. The raised portion goes inward to fit into the balancer. We've got a washer. We put a little bit of blue Loctite on here and our nut. We'll tighten that down in a second. Now we have the driven gear. This is going to go onto the crank. Now there's a couple things to take note of here. There's a punch mark on here, and there's also a punch mark on our counterbalancer gear, and there's a punch mark on the drive on the crankshaft. So I'm going to show you guys that in another angle. Hold up, before you put that gear on, there's a small plate that covers the crank seal that I forgot to install. I ended up having to go back in and install this later. It goes right here. It's just a small plate with 2 screws. Really easy to put on. Just wanted to mention this so that you don't forget to install it. But you want to make sure all 3 of these line up. So the punch mark up here, you want facing this punch mark. Again, guys, I'm going to show you where it goes. And then you want to line up these teeth. There we go. All right, hopefully you guys can see this here. Right there is our punch mark on the crank. And then these are the 2 punch marks on the gears. Just want to make sure all 3 of those are lined up. Then we've got our power valve governor. That's going to go up here. There is a small pancake bearing that goes on one side. And you see there's rollers on one side, but not the other. You want the rollers to face towards the actuator arm. And I don't believe there's an orientation for this one, so it can pop into place just like so. Then we have our primary drive gear. That's going to go on top of our driven gear. Line it up in the spleens or splines. That was weird, that just didn't want to go in place. And we've got a washer that goes on here. Put some Loctite on here. And this is a left-hand threaded nut. So you're going to go to the left to tighten it. All right, now we're going to tighten up our 2 nuts here. This is a left-hand thread, so don't forget you got to go to the left in order to tighten it. So in order to hold this in place, I'm going to do the connecting rod method. So basically you just get a pole and sneak it in up here. And I did go ahead and put these studs in when you guys weren't looking. So basically, if this tries to spin, it can't because it's holding through this pole. Connecting rods are made to withstand tremendous forces, so if you think you're going to break it, you'll be just fine. This isn't going to cause any damage at all. Now this goes to 75 to 90 foot-pounds, so we are going to go to 80. Okay. And then our counterbalancer, we're going to do the same thing, only we will go to 65 to 80 foot-pounds. So we're going to do 70, and this is a regular thread. There we go. Now before we put the clutch basket on, there's an idler gear that goes right here. I didn't see this mentioned in the manual. I don't know if I just can't find it or what. Sometimes service manuals have things in weird locations too, but I didn't see this in there. Anyways, it's real easy. That gear goes on there. You have a washer, and then you have a little clip that goes in place. Real easy step, but you don't want to forget it or you won't be able to kickstart your bike. All right, so now we can go ahead and do our clutch. We've got a washer that's going to go in place first. Put some assembly lube on our shaft. We've got a spacer. A little more lube. And a roller bearing. And again, more lube. Can never have too much lube. Then we'll put our basket in place. You might have to spin this to get it to line up with your idler gear. All right, we're nice and flush. And we've got another washer. And then our inner hub. Just got to line up the splines. Good to go. Now we're going to go ahead and put our clutch discs and fibers in. So here are the fibers. I've had them soaking in some Recluse 20 weight 50 oil. Super good oil. It's what I run in the 250R, and I just really like that oil. So we're going to go ahead and put this in. This is a competition clutch by Tusk. Very inexpensive, but effective. We're going to go ahead and we're going to go first a fiber. I just got done scuffing these plates. It's not really a necessary thing to do. It just helps these discs bind into those fibers or bite into them a little bit better. Gives you a more positive clutch feel. Anyways, as I was saying, there's a sharp edge and a rounded edge. You can line them all up, do them all the same way, or you can put them in alternating. It really doesn't matter. I like to put them all the same way though, because I'm weird like that. And then I also take the little divots here and kind of skip 2 spots each time. And before I put the pressure plate on, we're going to go ahead and tighten down our nut here. We've got a locking washer. This really should be replaced, but they can be reused. We'll put the locking washer in place, and then we have a nut. Going to put red Loctite on here. This will get tightened down to 30 to 43 foot-pounds of torque. Now, when I pulled this off, we used our Tusk clutch tool, and to put it on, we're going to use the impact method, which basically, we're just going to hold the clutch pack together by holding the friction of the discs and fibers, and we're just going to give this a couple quick knocks and get it into place nice and tight. And that should be good. And then we will bend. All right, that'll keep that in place. Now we're going to put our pressure plate on. We have, for our clutch actuator right here, this will go in the center, and we have a pancake bearing with the rollers facing downwards, like so. And this is going to come through like that. We're going to go ahead and put this in place. Make sure that's sitting nice and flush. We've got some Tusk competition clutch springs we're going to put in. These are just heavy duty. And then we're going to run these little bolts in. Kind of funny how small these things are for a Quadzilla. And just going to very gently bring these in with this Milwaukee impact. You got to be really careful with these. If you're not, you can snap off those fingers in there really easy. So I'm really just bringing them in. You want to go in a crisscross pattern here. You do not need Loctite on these. The tension from the springs will hold them in place. I'm going to snug these by hand. If you're going to torque these, I would want to go to maybe 7 foot-pounds. All right, now we'll put our dowel pins in place before we put our cover on. I've got a little bit of anti-seize on them as usual. Before I put the gasket in place, just like with the Stator side, I'm gonna put some grease on our gasket. Put this in place, we can hang it on our dowel pins. Now before we put the cover on, there's 2 things to take note of. You have this here for the impeller. You can see that spins. You need that to be lined up with the end of your crankshaft, and then your actuation gear right here. That needs to be facing backwards so that it lines up in here, so that when this spins, those little teeth in there, they'll grab here, and they'll actuate the clutch. There we go. Go ahead and run these in a crisscross pattern. We'll go ahead and snug these down by hand. If you're going to torque them, 8 foot-pounds. And then up here for the clutch actuator, there's another bolt. It's another special bolt. You guys can see the end of it. That's just going to go right in here and hold the actuator from coming up. And of course we have our oil fill plug. And then up under the other side, there's another small plug right here. Same thing as the other side. I've got a little copper washer on there. All right, we're ready to move on to the top end. We've got our brand new pre-owned piston right here. Compliments of JSR Racing. Thank you, brother. I did put new rings on here. I've already checked the ring gap. We're in spec. One of the rings actually needed to be shaved down just a little bit. I'm going to make sure that your piston rings are lined up on the piston pins, the little stoppers. And you want these rings moving nice and freely. Something you're usually not going to have to worry about if you're using a new piston. This top ring was actually a little snug though, and I had to take the ring out and clean the groove. But we should be good to go now. So we're going to be putting that in place. We have a brand new wrist pin bearing right here. Put a little bit of lube on there. Throw that in our rod. I'm going to go ahead and stuff the crank because we have to put these little washers on the sides. These are billet washers. These are an upgrade apparently for the Quadzilla. Another compliment to JSR Racing. And we're going to put our piston on, make sure we've got the little arrow facing forward. All right, and I guess we'll just have to place these washers in. And kind of line everything up. You guys are just gonna have to take my word for it. You can see the two washers on either side of the connecting rod. A little tedious, but just gotta make sure you don't drop them in the crank. Now we're gonna put new clips in. This is another one of those items you really don't want to reuse. Should always put new clips in as they lose their spring. There we go. You want to make sure that thing is clipped all the way in there. And you want the opening either to be at the bottom or the top. So before we put our cylinder on, we have to put our exhaust valve in the cylinder. Here is the exhaust valve. This bolt can come out. I have it in there. It's Loctited. And there is an O-ring on here. If you have a gasket kit, it should come with that O-ring so you can replace it. So we also have a bearing that goes on this side. We put assembly lube on the bearing and on the O-ring as well. Now I'm going to place this in with these two stoppers facing downwards. You'll see on the bottom here this little depression. A bolt is going to go through here and line up with that depression, so you want to make sure you have that correct. Get that lined up, and then you just got to press that O-ring in place. Going to very gently tap just to get that O-ring in there. You don't want to shear it off. It's just in an awkward position. And then you can see our hole in there. I'll line that up. Just a little too far there. Right about there, looks good. And then here's the bolt that's going to go in there. You can see it's a special bolt. It does have a crush washer on there. So we'll put that in place. Snug that down. Now we're going to come around to the other side. All right, now we've got a spring that goes in here. Fits in that little groove. And then we have this dial that's going to go on top, and then a plate. And on the plate, you can see it says 250 on the top and 0 at the bottom. We want to align this bottom portion. First, you want to get a hold of that spring, get it in the slot. I do have a new O-ring on here too. Let's see if we can get that O-ring to seat. There we go. Now we're going to put the plate on here with the 250 at the top. I'm going to put these two bolts in. I'm not going to tighten them down though. Now before we tighten these down, we want to spin this 360 degrees in a counterclockwise fashion, stopping back on that 0 mark. So we'll spin it, that's 180. And that is 360. Snug these down. Now I normally don't do this, but since these Quadzillas are notorious for blowing base gaskets, I'm going to put a little bit of gasket sealant by Permatex on both sides of the base gasket. This stuff is pretty easy to remove if you've got to take it off, and it works really well. I'm going to do both sides. All right, I'll let this set for about a minute, just to let that get a little bit dry. And there are two dowel pins. There's one on this side, and then there's one in the back. Now we're about to come down with the cylinder. Make sure you got some oil in the cylinder. This is 2-stroke oil that I'm putting in here. Some bean oil. Make sure your rings are lined up on the pins. And we'll slide this bad boy on. I want to make sure this power valve actuator isn't in the way. That went on nice and easy. No problem. Go ahead and hook up the actuation arm for the power valve. Whew, man. All right, now we've got these 2 long shoulder bolts, I guess you'd call them. They're going to go in the front, one on each side. Then there's another larger shoulder bolt that's going to go right here. And you've got 14mm bolts on either side in the back, and one up here in the front. Now if you're going to torque these go to about 25 to 30 foot-pounds. I'm just going to snug them down by hand, and then I will torque these once they're mounted in the frame and I have some leverage on the motor. For now, they'll just be snugged. And then these 2 bolts in the front get torqued to 8.5 foot-pounds. There's actually one more bolt, 8mm, that goes in threads up underneath into the cylinder. Just snug that one up. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and put our head in place. So first thing we're gonna do is put our gasket on. There's small holes, those go towards the exhaust side. I did put my studs back in, as you guys can see. So there's our gasket. Now we have this freaking cool head. Wow, pretty sweet. And then we've got our dome right here. I don't know what size John ordered. It says 62 on the top. It's scribed, so I'm assuming it's a 62. There are 2 O-rings in here. I'm gonna lube up the O-rings before I place this into the shell. All right, so we're gonna pop this in here. You can see it has an offset spark plug hole. You want that to be facing towards the left side, right about there. The head stay goes towards the back of the engine. Drop this in place. Boom. I'll put some new crush washers in place. And Pro Design even puts in these trick little acorn nuts. Freaking sweet. Yeah. Now for now, I just ran those down in the lowest setting on the impact gun. But when this is in the frame, I'm gonna tighten these down, work my way up to 22 foot-pounds. Now we're gonna put our reeds in, make sure they're nice and clean and they're sealing properly. To my surprise, there's no gasket for these. So there is a little rubber O-ring that goes around here. I guess that's what seals these things. I'm gonna put a little bit of grease on that O-ring just to help seal it. Pop that in place. Then our intake boot, do the same with a little bit of grease. You can see these things here, they're called stuffers. It's supposed to help with the charge going into the cylinder. I'm just going to snug these up by hand. A couple more things here and we will be finished. Put our new exhaust gasket in place. And our exhaust flange, you guys should have seen this thing when we pulled it off. It was just filled with carbon, so I cleaned all that out. The hook will go to the left side if you're facing the front of the engine. And I have these little centering pieces that are going to go on here. They came off, I believe, with this because the holes are a little bit too big for this. We want it to be centered up. It's important to have everything lined up for the exhaust. We've got our power valve cover, just like all the other gaskets. Coat it with a little bit of grease, stick her in place. And a couple last things. We've got a little drain bolt that goes down here. Got a new crush washer on there. And I know you guys are wondering, why haven't I put the water pump cover on yet? Well, that's because I broke this bolt right here. Because this is a left-hand thread and I was unaware. So I actually don't have, luckily I was able to extract this thing. You can see where I drilled it and it spun right out, thank God. But yeah, I have one of these on order. I couldn't find this at the hardware store. So it's a special bolt. That should be here tomorrow. That's gonna have to go in the top here. So, you know, I can't really assemble this until that's done, but for purposes of this video, there would be a gasket that you're gonna put on here, a rubber O-ring. And then you got 2 dowels, 1, 2. And this goes in place. All right, guys, first ever Quadzilla engine is in the books. It really wasn't that bad to build. It's kind of cool working with a 2-stroke that's this big. This is the biggest 2-stroke I've ever messed with. There's a couple more things that I want to do. I'm going to check the squish clearance. I'm not going to do that on camera. But that's definitely something you want to do, especially if you're changing around like the head design and stuff like that. You want to make sure you got the appropriate amount of squish. You get detonation, all kinds of problems like that. I did throw the Kickstarter on here. It's always good to turn the motor over. It feels good. Just to make sure nothing's binding up or anything. And the other thing we're going to do is when I put this in the frame, I'm going to torque down the head bolts and just make sure that our base bolts are nice and tight and everything. Otherwise, this engine is ready to go. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and consider hitting that subscribe button. I will have all of the links to special tools and products in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I will see you in the next one. Peace out.